procedure on the daughter of the family. This was the price to pay for Benjamin Douglas's avarice. Whilst Miccolo was having his entertainment at the lower levels of this palatial location, XXV kept the interrogation alive, as Benjamin Douglas persevered on with his unwavering obstruction. The two brothers had quite the different philosophies when it came to just these kinds of situations. Xtheine would of course most often choose the road of savagery in order to attain the required information, while XXV would most commonly opt for the route of the hands-off approach, so to say. As the oldest sibling would utilize manipulation and other psychological trickery to unearth the desired intelligence. While it is most certainly true that Douglas had been resisting XXV's efforts, what wasn't quite as correct was his success at just such attempts. Anders had indeed obtained much of what was required given the proper interval of time. Speaking of time, about half an hour after his departure, Xtheine had made his return to the upstairs room where Benjamin Douglas was located at. "Any progress here?" the devil inquired, having just barely entered the room. "Yes, we have made some," XXV responded to his brother while keeping the unbreakable focus over the laptop. "I was able to acquire the credentials for the laptop with much of the information that we require on it. I have been browsing it while you were away. Mr. Douglas here did provide some of the information needed to access the more personal data, yet overall, I am afraid he has been less than helpful." XXV spoke without averting his eyes from the display nearest himself. "I have most of the information we came here for, but given some more time, I have no doubts I will be able to gather all of it." He finished while still glued to the screen of the laptop. Xtheine, after hearing his brother's encouraging response, had suddenly directed his vision towards Douglas, whose head was still mostly down at that time, facing the ground. "You want to know what I did while I was gone, Mr. Douglas?" Xtheine spoke in a deeply mocking tone, while smirking in great eagerness to disclose the act and the details within. "I showed your women what a real man feels like down there." He then added, while laughing out loud, as frustration was no more, it was now replaced by a sense of severe self-approbation. Douglas started to cry when he realized exactly what the Artiphenoid's comment had entailed. Unfortunately for them, they didn't last long. Xtheine had dropped the knife he used on the women right in front of Douglas. "I guess size does matter after all, huh?" He was referencing the size of the knife, of course, as it was 8 inches long and still had the concoction of blood and feces covering it in its entirety. Douglas, immediately after witnessing the knife, broke down entirely. The sobs of the man filled the previously silent room as his mental state was decimated. A composite of emotions had entered the businessman, yet not a single one carried the weight of positivity. Douglas could not stop the waterworks, even losing the ability to speak temporarily, as he would attempt to do just that on several occasions, but in the end, the weeping would simply be a fence too high to climb. X2 laughed manically at the man's pain, greatly enjoying the sounds of the indescribably immense suffering that he had brought onto him. XXV's concentration remained unaltered, as his eyes still served the screen of the laptop while the two were having their exchange. Needless to say, Anders was not affected by what was currently happening inside the room even remotely. "Please no, please no. Oh God, no," cried the businessman continuously after finally regaining the ability of speech. XVII, however, was no longer in the laughing mood as Lady Aya had visited the creation once more. Deep sense of disdain had now burdened XD, and this display of weakness was unfolding in front of him. "What you even crying for?" the heartless Artiphenoid asked in an oddly calm tone. "You crying over your wife? Or is it over your daughter? But why cry over her?" Miccolo bombarded the man with inquisition while retaining his composure. Your daughter wasn't going to amount to anything anyway. She was just going to end up like her mother, just another useless whore taking cocks down her throat. Ixthii rediscovered derision, and with it, he once again fell under the charm of maniacal laughter. Don't believe me. Ixthii had suddenly stopped his laughing biennale. You should have seen the time her and I had together. He resumed to speak of the recently deceased with an overwhelming administration of disrespect. Douglas was now beyond broken and could no longer control much of his actions at all. The man started to shudder while tied to a chair, as if going into shock while living through hell. Of course, his hell would only get worse as Ixthion was hardly finished with his scornful soliloquy. "You are so fucking pathetic!" The artificial creation burst out with wrath, shouting at the already devastated man. "I cannot wait to get my fucking hands on you, you fucking parasite. I will give you something real to cry about." Benjamin's head remained down the whole time while Ixthion was talking. Perhaps Douglas had not registered what the artiphenoid had articulated, or perhaps he had registered it all. Despite, Benjamin Douglas continued to cry uncontrollably. This display would come to an end soon enough, however, as XXV had now finished surveying the information on the laptop. "We got it all now. Ixthion." XXV suddenly spoke out, closing the laptop and lifting up from his seat. "I have all the information we came here for. I will be leaving now." His words bore quite the resolute resonance of professionalism. "I will wait for you in the car, as I understand that you have some matters to attend to here, XXV said, having now redirected his gaze over to the businessman. "Mr. Douglas," Anders addressed the man as his voice escalated, "you have been less than cooperative with us. I hope you realize that much of what went on here on this day could have been easily avoided." Douglas produced no response while listening to the older brother, drowning in the sea of misery still, with a lifesaver of hope nowhere near to be found. "I would say that you do not deserve what's about to happen to you, but I am afraid that would be a lie," XXV concluded while still scanning the helpless man. "Goodbye, Mr. Douglas." The artiphenoid finished his sentiment of merit and left the room entirely. Well, said Ixthion slowly and methodically while reaching for the knife and obtaining it once more. Miccolo closed the distance between himself and the businessman. With only a few steps, now inhabiting exceedingly near proximity while placing the knife well nigh to the man's face, and as the cold blood and scat-covered steel grazed Benjamin's skin, the artificial creation ominously declared, "The devil is visiting you tonight." Ixthion then progressed to torture the man. On the following day, the two brothers returned to the lawyer's office to close the deal, so to say. The attorney resided inside his office lonesome while listening to classical music and having his favourite beverage, Scotch. Much like on the day when Shapiro had first met Ixthion, the White Devil once again made his bombastic entrance. XVI, I smashed through the door, taking it off the hinges yet again, with the lawyer being vastly alarmed by his unexpected entry yet again. "Oh no! I just replaced that door," said the lawyer as a sudden spell of surprise had overwhelmed him and had even forced him to propel the Scotch out of his mouth while the two brothers had made their gratuitously dramatic ingress. "Perhaps it's best if you keep the door open from now on, Mr. Shapiro," XXV stated, sounding like an authority figure of sorts, having quickly reached the position most closely to the lawyer's desk. "Yes, that's probably not the worst idea." Edward Shapiro stated while in the process of wiping of the scotch residue off his desk from the aftermath of his most recent impulsive reaction. "Chopsticks, you got any more liquor?" Exthion inquired in his typical tone after spending a considerable amount of time scanning the cabinet of fancy spirits. "Oh yes, of course, Mr. Devil." The attorney quickly dropped his effort of cleansing in order to accommodate Exthion's decisive and fully predictable request. "My manners flew out of the window again, it seems." As the lawyer rose up to his feet to grab Miccolo his drink, the young artifinoid once again annexed Shapiro's chair, having once again begun the process of smoking with his feet up on the desktop. Just like before, Shapiro confuted nada, opting to sit in the client's chair upon making his return with the drinks once more. Déjà vu indeed. "There is your drink, Mr. Devil," said the lawyer, resembling closely a waiter in the manner which he handed the bottle of the rather expensive liquor over to Exthion, providing a smile at the end to escort the transfer along. "Anyway, how did it go, gentlemen?" the lawyer asked with eagerness, anticipating some good news with his eyes directed towards Anders Greylove, who remained standing. "It could have gone smoother, but in the end it was a success, Mr. Shapiro," XXV said calmly while reaching deep inside one of his jacket pockets to pull something out. "All of the information you have requested is on this here flash drive, Mr. Shapiro," Anders stated, now handing the flash drive over to Shapiro. "We will discuss numbers in more detail once you are done sifting through the data." XXV concluded no longer having the possession of the little drive, as that responsibility now fell on the lawyer's shoulders. "Yes, of course, Mr. Greylove. I would be happy to look over this data, and the moment I am finished, I will contact you." The lawyer spoke while significantly uplifted, gripping the drive firmly. "How did it go with Douglas? What happened there?" Shapiro asked with the care and interest in his voice suddenly evacuating, similar to an animal abandoning a blazing house. Edward was just simply going through the motions when concerning the topic of Benjamin Douglas. "A bad fire?" said Exthion after taking a huge drag of his cigarette before returning to destroying the bottle of liquor. "A terrible accident or whatever. It happens, you know." Miccolo finished the sentiment and the drink alongside it. The brothers had, of course, burned much of what went on inside the Douglas summer home in order to destroy any evidence. "Mr. Douglas did not make it, Mr. Shapiro," XXV said in his usual cold tone while expanding on his siblings' most recent statements. "Oh, that's very unfortunate," the lawyer stated, displaying no emotion whatsoever, once again finding himself unable to generate the interest required while concerning the topic of discussion. "At any rate, Mr. Shapiro," XXV stated, quickly glancing over at his brother in an effort to obtain visual confirmation, "you have work to do, and we must be going now." XXV appended while now returning his sight to the lawyer as Anders had indeed acquired the previously mentioned confirmation. The two artifinoids had begun the motions of egressing the attorney's bashful office. While passing the liquor cabinet, Exthions broke the silence. "I am taking 2 more bottles with me, chapsticks," said the man, already having the 2 bottles securely in his embrace. "Yes, of course, Mr. Devil," Shapiro responded while fully anticipant of this development as he began to relocate to his freshly vacated chair. The duo was now finally ready to leave the confines of the office. "Good evening, Mr. Shapiro," said XXV as the two had now started to make their final strides through the door, however, just like the time prior. Shapiro once again hindered this already elongated departure. "Oh, Mr. Greylove and Mr. Devil, just one more thing." The lawyer rushed to the door frame in order to complete his remark.
"Yes, Edward," XXV responded instantly, with the two brothers now standing in the hall of the building while addressing the attorney.
"Thank you. I really mean it." The lawyer was truly sincere, and this was very much apparent by the expression that had been assembled across his face. With XXV offering no response, Extesekans took it upon himself to fill the void. "Don't mention it, Chopsticks." The pair of brothers were now finally extricated, and did in fact make their long-awaited exit. Edward Shapiro watched them leave through the main doors of the building before swiftly returning to his seat at his desk. Once comfortably positioned inside the chair, Shapiro glanced at the flash drive on the table, smiled, and muttered to himself, "Thank you a lot for this." Chapter 6. 3. A Devil is Born, Dr. Strauss. "Why me?" inquired Bentley, while sincerely surprised by the proposal that XVII and XXV had just extended onto him. The three were located inside the mansion in the living room, with X the Eins sitting at his desk, while the other two males remained standing. Bentley was positioned on the other side of the desk, while Anders was standing near the ruthless one. "Why not you?" Mikolo answered with the rapidity of a falcon and a neutral tone, while clasping his hands together and his feet up on the desk as per usual. "Why not you?" Bentley was just as quick with his response time, playing hot potato with the question. Hesitancy began to construct a foundation inside Johnson's mind. Imitation is the sincerest form of faggotry, Bentley. Exthekan stated with his tone now hardening, yet no aggression surfacing still, while rejoicing under a waterfall of pride for his use of the expression. This pride, however, was rather short-lived, as XXV had now entered the discourse. "It's flattery, Exthanv." XXV had swiftly corrected his brother's rather unsuccessful attempt. "A fairly common occurrence, this. Oscar Wilde's full quote is, 'Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery that mediocrity can pay to greatness.'" The gifted creation concluded his lecture-like response while glancing over at his younger brother. The waterfall of pride had dried out, seemingly. "Are you done with the lesson now, Goldilocks?" Exthekan mockingly responded to his older brother's correction, referencing a certain fairy tale, while slightly annoyed by the sudden interjection. "It would take you two niggers like 10 seconds to capture this guy. That's all I am saying." Bentley continued his inquisition into the matter, while still not fully understanding why he was selected for this specific operation. "Why send me to do this?" he added with a countenance of uncertainty. "Because we are busy, Bentley." Second attempted to elucidate the situation. "Gray has been on my ass about this Strauss guy, so someone has to go and abduct him." Mikolo concluded in a composed tone while sounding like a professor himself. "Look, man, when I enter people's homes, I take their belongings, and not the people themselves, my nigger." Bentley was trying his best to prompt a reconsideration of this task while sounding animated. "How would I even do this?" He ceased his effort with an inquiry. "With this, Mr. Johnson."
XXV made his return into the conversation, only this time he had something to show.
Anders pulled out a syringe out of a case that was located on the table at which Hexthine was seated. "Inside this here syringe, Mr. Johnson, there is 20 mL of propofol. I have altered the chemical composition of the substance slightly to provide more kick, so to say. It will incapacitate the target for over 2 hours, which is more than enough time to bring him back to this location. This is how you do this, Mr. Johnson, as to provide an answer to your inquiry." XXV finished his presentation while adding yet another layer of the professorial flavour. "So what, do I just stick him when he is asleep or something?" Bentley inquired, having now given up the effort of changing the brothers' minds completely. "That decision would fall onto your own volition, Mr. Johnson." XXV responded with haste and great composure. It is abundantly vital that the doctor remains unharmed, Mr. Johnson." Anders had now finished his explanation. Johnson took some time to contemplate while looking over at the brothers, as he still lacked confidence due to this kind of request being highly incongruous with his skill set. However, after a relatively brief interval of boundless contemplation, Johnson had commenced speaking once more. "All right then, tell me about this Strauss." Dr. Jonathan Kaiser Strauss was an exceptionally skilled surgeon and a graduate of Stanford University, in fact, with the highest honor of summa cum laude to accompany his academic effort. Strauss was undoubtedly one of the best in this very field. While more than capable of performing surgery within many different disciplines, Jonathan's true calling was plastic surgery, as the man possessed quite the inviolable admiration of beauty. Female beauty, to be more precise. After spending many years inside the glorious institution that is Stanford, Strauss was able to open up a clinic shortly after his graduation. It did not take long for the man to become quite the august force just within the field of plastic surgery, and to assemble quite the reputation due to his unequalled ability with a knife. The man was truly a genius and truly a wonder, however. As is frequently the case, the profoundly brilliant often come bearing a darker side. Strauss was no exception. Throughout his life, Jonathan had struggled greatly with romantic relationships, as he would attempt one after another, with the final result always ending up being a total collapse. While Strauss found women enchanting, he could not perform sexually. Strauss was effectively impotent. This very reality would drive the doctor to the edge of complete insanity as he undertook many different ventures in an effort to cure himself of this debilitating affliction. However, to the doctor's great dismay, nothing was producing the desired effect. Jonathan Kaiser kept plunging deeper and deeper into a complete existential paralysis. Throughout the years, Strauss had not established many meaningful plutonic relationships. This was a decision made on his own accord, one should add. However, the bonds he had constructed were rather significant, and one of these connections created was with a man by the name of Joseph Price, whom Strauss had met while both were enrolled in medical school. Price was not quite as brilliant as Strauss, but was hardly an incompetent man, as he, too, became encompassed within the medical field, albeit his profession of choice was one that the mysterious Lady Death herself was quite fond of. The young Price was a mortician, and he had owned and operated a funeral home located in the downtown area of Los Angeles. As a result of just that, Price had spent many of nights working late, while Strauss himself often provided Joseph with company. On one of the aforementioned nights, Price was called away on a rather urgent matter, which left the young Dr. Strauss in an unforeseen, solitary state. When Price vacated the vicinity of the building while making a promise of timely return, the doctor took the opportunity to survey the location he was currently residing in much closer than the times prior. Strauss began to wander the rather large and tranquil building without any particular objective in mind, and while doing just that, he had come across a sight that most would find remarkably dismal. Jonathan Kaiser Strauss found himself lonesome in a room with a recently deceased woman, and a very young and attractive one at that. While this would be a display too woeful for most, it proved to be an unexpected boon for the young doctor. After scrupulously scanning the contours of the stunning corpse, Strauss had experienced a phenomenon he never had the pleasure of experiencing before. Jonathan Kaiser Strauss now found himself standing inside this chamber of serenity, fully erect. The doctor approached the newly retired in order to investigate and to possibly bring a higher level of understanding to his abnormal reaction. However, this effort was not to be. As a sound was heard in the other room, This was a sound of the main building doors being unlocked, which of course meant that the owner had now made his return. Strauss did not mention the occurrence that took place inside the construct to his dear friend. Dr. Jonathan Strauss had finally discovered the remedy to his crippling malaise. After this crucial unearthing took place, Strauss experienced a drastic transformation of character. The doctor had never been one to succumb to the influences of fear, and now knew the appropriate steps that he would require to take in order to fill the void deep within his heart. Dr. Strauss commonly began to acquire the services of the ladies of the night, as they say, while wearing heavy makeup to disguise himself. This was not done to avoid embarrassment, however. This form of concealment was utilized in order to avoid any legal inquiries, as what the young doctor was now executing did not quite resonate well with the law. After hiring the women, Strauss would bring them to different furtive locales where he would then proceed to drug them. This was an effort orchestrated to imitate most closely the state of expiration, if you will. Now, it does have to be mentioned that the doctor did not experience the full sexual arousal that had taken place inside Price's funeral home prior, however. It did suffice, since he was able to perform many different venereal acts while the women were under the hex of heavy sedation. This endeavour would continue for quite some time, but much like all things, it too would eventually meet its finale. On one of the nights, as the doctor was going through the regular motions while in the company of the anaesthetized courtesan, something rather undesired had taken place. The woman began to recoup consciousness whilst in the middle of a sexual act. Apparently, the eccentric doctor had administered a much lower dose than usual. This was a mistake that was most assuredly discrepant with his character. Governed by momentary panic, Strauss assailed the woman in hopes of delivering her back to the state of greatly craved torpor. However, the brave sex worker fought back dauntlessly, and was even able to overwhelm the doctor while using the bear mace located inside her purse. Once free from the prison that was the vehicle, she ran like her life depended on it, as it very much did. Eventually she would reach civilization, so to speak, and this is where things went from bad to worse for the young and deviant doctor. The woman notified the local patrolling police officers. Strauss, while chasing the lady, had confronted a force much too vigorous, and was quickly subdued by the two law enforcers. Strauss was arrested and taken in immediately after. Jonathan's hobby had come to a rather abrupt end. A long and arduous court trial it was, deciding the fate of the unlucky doctor. However, the man did have quite the legal representation, as it was indeed none other than Edward Shapiro. It was through Shapiro that XXV had discovered Jonathan Strauss, in fact. Aggravated sexual assault and rape charges tyrannized the doctor's psyche, as he was now facing a substantial punishment, one that would deduct more than a quarter of the man's life even. However, the virtuoso of a lawyer was able to diminish the charges to just a mere sexual assault. As a result of Shapiro's magic, Strauss was given 7 years in minimum security prison. Whilst inside the sombre bastion that was the penitentiary, Strauss was a model prisoner with no blemishes besmirching his record. Due to just that factor, Dr. Jonathan Strauss was released 2 years earlier than originally designed, serving only 5 years in total. On the date of December 19th, 2009, the now 38-year-old Dr. Strauss was once again a free man, rehabilitated and reformed, ready to start fresh and begin a new life. Well, at least that's what some would want to hear. However, reality is often not a fairy tale, but rather grim. Jonathan Strauss now found himself fully drowned, not only in the state of despotic dissatisfaction, but with a grand sense of disdain introduced into it as well. Strauss had promised himself that he would never make the foolish mistakes that resulted in his previous undoing ever again. Dr. Jonathan Kaiser Strauss had now committed himself to murder. In the following years, Strauss ramped up his game, so to say, no longer going after prostitutes exclusively. In his mind, Jonathan contained an overbearing image of the perfect woman, and this woman was not one that was just simply born, not quite, as this woman was to be created. After his sentencing, Jonathan's medical license had been revoked. The man had seemingly lost everything. However, with the help of his loyal confidant, Joseph Price, Strauss was able to get back on his feet, while even working for the aforementioned Price, who was entirely in the dark when regarding Jonathan's newly found vision. It should be added, as some time had passed, Strauss had purchased a house of his own, and a rather decent one at that. Eventually, the ex-surgeon would return to a more normal state, if you will, both financially and mentally. At least that would seem like the reality to a benighted outsider looking in. However, once all was in place, Strauss set the effort in motion to fulfill his darkest, innermost desires. Jonathan Kaiser began kidnapping and murdering women, after which he would dismember their corpses and utilize his unmatched surgical ability to stitch the body parts back together, while using the fragments of all of his victims, completing what he would refer to as the perfect woman. And while his attempts did not always reach the high standard of what he would deem a success, the doctor would eventually accumulate the experience required in order to perfect his creations. This was hardly all, however, as one more act had to be commenced, as it was quite the vital piece of the puzzle to this entire endeavour. Dr. Strauss would perform many different sexual acts on his creations, some of which included cunnilingus, anilingus, and all sort of different types of penetration, of course. Strauss would conduct these acts of carnal intimacy with his creations on more than just a single occasion, and to preserve his beauties until the very next craving would once again take control of the E-man, he would store them inside freezers with glass doors, so that he could always witness his masterpieces of perfection as they were on full D. Strauss would not forego the ever-so-significant act of hygiene for those who are wondering, as he would often lave the cadavers after spending time with them. Jonathan Kaiser Strauss the Necrophile was born. A warm, peaceful night. This was with only the sound of distant crickets providing any notable background noise. And on this specific night, Bentley was progressing onward with his mission of bringing Dr. Jonathan Strauss into the family, with the doctor himself having no prior knowledge of just such an intent. Bentley had little trouble getting past the minute security of the premises which the doctor resided in, and had now made his way to the door. Having plenty of experience in just this matter, the door did not offer much of a challenge for the young gangster neither. Bentley was now inside the house of the necrophile. Once inside, Bentley Johnson proceeded with great caution, as this was very much required. Bentley's initial idea was to administer the serum that XXV had given him while the doctor was asleep. This was, after all, a rather late time in the night. However, the doctor was a nocturnal creature, as it may, and as a result of just that, he was not even remotely in a state of slumber. Jonathan Strauss, in fact, could be found deep inside the basement of his modest house, working on his projects, as this was very common, of course. Bentley, having no awareness of that fact, was making strides through the house while remaining as silent as a mouse. Room by room, the furtive gangster would search with little success to show for his efforts as he struggled to locate the mischievous surgeon. Whilst in this process, however, Bentley had unfortunately made a rather clumsy error. The gangster, while enveloped by darkness, had walked into a bookshelf. which resulted in a distinct resonance. The doctor, who was still within the confines of the basement, was now alerted to the presence of the uninvited man. Within the embrace of the covert gangbanger was a syringe. As was mentioned prior, however, Bentley was hardly the only one with the ability to immobilize through administration of narcotics. The doctor, while now fully apprised of the situation, had acquired a bottle of chloroform, which was commonly used for an act one should be able to decipher themselves, considering the man's endeavours. With a soaked rag of chloroform, Jonathan patiently waited behind the garage door, as he had surmised that the intruder would eventually make his way towards and into the basement. The doctor's stoicism paid dividends. When Bentley did, in fact, step into the basement, while fully unaware of the presence behind the door, Jonathan Strauss, without any hesitation, ambushed the gangster. Clamping the rag to his face with the force of an alligator, clamping his jaw onto his prey. The chemical compound had come out on top on this day. Bentley Johnson was no longer conscious. A rather short and tragic end to the tale of the young. Bentley, perhaps. A spacious basement this was, with a bench, many tools, medical equipment, and dim lighting to accompany it all. That was hardly all, however, as in the middle of this location was none other than Bentley himself. The unlucky young man was secured to a chair with no foreseeable possibility of getting loose, while now beginning to return to the state of responsiveness. Once the prior-mentioned state was obtained by Bentley, he was an audience to quite the ghastly sight. Just mere moments after the youthful male opened his eyes, in front of him was positioned one of the good doctor's creations. This was a piece of art that was grotesque indeed, with the legs once belonging to a black woman, while the torso clearly borrowed from a white woman. The arms of this work were of a brown hue, while the face itself was a mixture of all of the above. Portions of olive skin stitched together next to patches brown, black and white skin, with the hair also sharing this very same characteristic, as this beauty had red, brown and blonde hair all present. The eyebrows were trimmed, while the lips and eyes were coated with makeup. The nails on the hands and feet were cut, and even polished with numerous different unique colours. While on the subject of eyes, however, one should mention that this creation did not possess any eyeballs, and this was, in fact, the very first thing that Bentley had observed upon recovering from his state of heavy slumber. The deep abyss of seemingly perpetual pitch blackness from within the depths of the orbital cavity welcomed the distressed Bentley. "What the fuck?" the young Johnson shouted in an ear-piercing, petrified tone, having now fully regained consciousness. "What the fuck is this, man?" He continued the inquiry, while still thoroughly disturbed and having considerable difficulty taking his gaze off the doctor's creation. "She is beautiful, isn't she?" Strauss had now introduced himself into the conversation while sounding composed as he stood inside the veil of darkness the basement corner had provided. "Where are you? What the fuck is this thing?" Bentley was unrelenting with his inquisition, while buried under a veneer of consternation. Bentley proceeded to wobble violently while constrained inside the rugged medical chair in an effort to reclaim liberty. However, his efforts were all for naught. "Thing?" The doctor's voice escalated, producing an extraordinarily resonant tone with unabashed wrath serving as the fuel. "She has a name, you know." Strauss continued, now opting to leave the comfort of the shadow while gradually returning to his normal speaking voice. "Oh, it's because of the eyes, isn't? I get it now," he resumed, while now fully exposed by the feeble illumination inside the basement while nearing the two newly introduced. "The eyes are the hardest ones to implant. They leak often if you aren't careful while removing them. They also don't stay fixated too well once inside the skull. The doctor explained the situation to the gangster much like a father would to his son. "Speaking of the eyes, I am glad you showed up." The doctor began to move towards the workbench while talking to the unfortunate Bentley. "Provided me with a new set to attempt to implant." Jonathan was now speaking with his back towards Johnson while occupied at the bench. "This shit is fucked, man. This shit is fucked." Bentley continued the shouting effort, shaken to his core, and once again attempting to free himself via erratic movement.
Don't worry about it. The doctor resumed, occupying the bench still.
"I will put you under anesthesia before I remove your pretty eyes." The doctor finished his sentiment with a rather unnerving chuckle to accommodate Bentley Johnson, while witnessing his captor starting to gather the tools necessary for the above-mentioned procedure, had to think quickly in order to buy himself some time. Bentley knew that XXV and XVI I would most assuredly be near his location by now, since the young man had not yet returned with the doctor in his possession as planned, and quite a considerable amount of time had already passed. "If you kill me, the people who sent me will be very mad." Bentley was now speaking with a newly discovered confidence, having now gained the ability of reigning in the paralyzing fear from before. "This won't end well for you." Johnson continued his attempt to buy himself some much-needed time. "What?" the doctor said while chuckling to himself. "Are they going to send another low-level gangbanger to steal my stuff? And you think I should be intimidated by that?" the doctor stated while now having all the tools required for the operation amassed. "I could always use more body parts for my work anyway." He then added, while entirely dismissing the threatening tone Bentley had attempted with, "I wasn't sent here to steal from you. I was sent here to steal you." Bentley kept on with assertiveness still present. The young man was not willing to see his life end in such a calamitous fashion. "What? Steal me?" The doctor took the bait, as the tone of his voice was now filled with bewilderment and intrigue. "Why would someone want to abduct me?" He then inquired of the young gangster, attempting to gain an understanding. Bentley had begun his purposefully and greatly elongated explanation in hopes of securing the time required for the two brothers to show up. Johnson's plan ended up working to its fruition, as during his lengthy exposition, more clamour was heard coming from the upstairs area of the house. The culprit responsible for this noise was and, ironically enough, the sound made was a result of the cloddish artiphenoid ramming into the same exact bookshelf that Bentley had run into earlier in the night. The doctor swiftly reacted to this development and progressed out of the basement, with a baseball bat ready in case. Once the doctor had reached the upstairs, in front of him in the corridor that led to the underground stood two males. XXV and XVI I were now facing off with the devious Jonathan Strauss. Not being a fighter, and not possessing the physique required to attempt to fend off the additional intruders, Jonathan just simply chose to converse with them instead. "May I help you two gentlemen?" Strauss asked with a collected tone, and the bat lowered, fully understanding that aggression would not serve him well in this particular situation. "You may start by relocating yourself into the living room and staying there for the time being." XXV had answered the doctor's inquisition with his own tone of frigidness. "I am sure you are plenty intelligent as to understand what would happen in a case of resistance. Aren't you, Dr. Strauss?" XXV had now his turn to ask the questions. Strauss was in fact plenty intelligent to understand the implication made by XXV. Not to mention the fact that XXV knew his name as well as the location of his residence. Strauss immediately realized the situation was much more complicated than initially assumed. Jonathan showed no resistance and proceeded to do as requested. Jonathan Strauss was escorted by Extathynes into the living room, where the two remained while XXV ventured on into the depths of the basement. "Fuck! I knew you would show up," Bentley shouted with a sense of great relief to accompany his words. "Get me out of here, man, please," Bentley continued. "Remain calm, Mr. Johnson." XXV composedly responded to the young gangster's cries. "You are no longer in danger," the creation stated as he began undoing the buckles that had been precluding Bentley's freedom of movement. Once this was done, Bentley began to speak once more. "Thanks, Anders." Bentley was recollected once more. "That was too close. I mean, look at this fucked up shit in front of me." "What even is that?" Bentley was speaking while referring to the thing from his and Doctor's previous interchange. "Yes, it is quite impressive," XXV stated shortly after directing his vision towards the corpse. "The surgical competency on display, that is," he added after further and closer examination of the Doctor's creation. "Yeah. Whatever, man. I need to get the fuck out of here," Bentley said with an oppressive urgency taking him over fully. "Certainly, Mr. Johnson," Anders quickly replied. Bentley took very little time to leave the location, which served as the foundation for quite the nightmare for the newly liberated male. XXV, on the other hand, opted to remain within the walls of the basement in order to scrutinize the Doctor's work in its full. Once Bentley Johnson arrived at the living room, Extide addressed him. "Stay here and watch him. I want to see what's inside that basement." Skayes stated in the most of neutral tones while beginning to make strides towards the basement without even waiting for Bentley's response. "Hey man, I don't want to be near this crazy-ass motherfucker anymore." Bentley's fear started to make his unwanted return once again, it seemed, while accompanied by a layer of frustration to go along. "Stay here, Blueberry. He is not a threat. He is tied up." Ixayan responded while completely sincere, as the Doctor was in fact bound to the chair in the living room with rope that the two brothers had brought with them. Mikolo had left the living room shortly after his remark. Bentley and Strauss found themselves in a rather familiar situation, only of course this time the roles were reversed, as the Doctor was now the one who found himself in bondage. Bentley glanced at the man, and perhaps this was highly regrettable, as Strauss drew up quite the sinister smile with a spice of mockery lodged deep within. "Fuck you, man," Johnson muttered while quickly averting his gaze from the demented Doctor. The image of the Doctor's face would most certainly be forever imprinted deep inside the young gangster's mind. Xayans had made his arrival at the basement, and the two brothers were now once more reunited inside that little site of horrors. "This stitching job is remarkable," stated XXV, while genuinely impressed by what was evinced in front of him. "The attention to detail as well as the surgical ability is astounding. This Doctor is clearly exceptionally skilled at his craft, XVII. Anders concluded, unable to break the ocular fixation. "You need some time alone with his work here, XXV?" Exverben stated while beginning an effort of locating a cigarette inside one of his pockets. "I won't tell the rest of the family that. This is what gets you off." He appended another sentiment while endearingly ridiculing his brother's admiration for Jonathan's projects. "No need, XD." XXV swiftly responded, while not even registering his siblings' line of humour, as was often the case. "In fact, we are all done here, and can now join the Doctor and Mr. Johnson in the living room." XXV then ceased his examination at once, and the two brothers went on to make their return to the recently mentioned location. Once arrived, Exthyans was the first to address the fettered man. "Quite the operation you got going on down there, Joseph Mengele." The shameless artifinoid spoke with an injection of jest while referencing the Angel of Death with a fully lit cigarette. "Just because of my German heritage, you call me A Nazi? Strauss inquired of Said, while genuinely perturbed by the suggestion, omitting any reproach concerning the topic of smoking inside the house. No, it's because you are fucked in the head is why I called you a Nazi. XV, I gunned out a response while chuckling. But hey, the Artifinoid continued, forming a surprisingly cordial smile. I am not one to judge. He then stated, being completely truthful as political ideologies, alongside other human constructs, meant very little to someone like Exthianv. Hey man, Bentley had suddenly injected himself into the exchange with urgency still present. I want to get the fuck out of this house. Do you need me any more? He inquired while still trying his best to avert eye contact with the doctor, clearly still deeply affected by what had transpired on this day. We can take care of things from this point on, Mr. Johnson. XXV stated in a near instant, having already fully anticipated Bentley's request. Have fun, Blueberry. Exceptions chimed in, ever so slightly mocking the young man and the experience he had gone through. Johnson wasted no time leaving the premises after his release. He was quite shaken.
Mykola Grailov now directed his attention towards the bound doctor.
What did you intend to do with him exactly? He asked Strauss with a knife of intrigue, perforating his inquest. I was going to use his eyes for one of my creations. The doctor answered earnestly, and without any emotion present in his tone, while homed in on XVI. Exeons had very much enjoyed this response, as he found himself in quite the state of delirium as a result, with maniacal laughter once again harbouring within. After this laughing fit was no longer, XXV had begun with his contribution to the intercourse. Dr. Strauss, the Artifinoid stated, shifting his vision from his brother onto the doctor. My name is Anders Grailov, and this is my brother, Mykola Grailov. We find ourselves inside your house for a very simple reason. XXV had taken a slight respite while beginning to near the doctor in the chair. That reason being recruitment. He continued, Our organization could use a man such as yourself and the level of surgical talent that you possess. Anders had finished his surprisingly terse statement considering the complex matter that was being discussed. And this is how your organization recruits new members? Strauss had inquired of XXV with a heavy dose of displeasure amidst his words. By barging into their homes and tying them to a chair? The man continued his bombardment while retaining a deeply sour tone. Exeons had chuckled at the doctor's most recent remark, finding it rather amusing. XXV, on the other hand, did not. Dr. Strauss, I do not believe that you occupy a position of a moral arbiter, considering what we have recently discovered. An instant ricochet of disparagement this was, formulated by XXV, rendering the doctor rather unfit to continue his line of attack. Fine. Jonathan Strauss had conceded his effort. What is your organization, and what is it that you require me for exactly? The aberrant surgeon was now speaking in a much more subdued tone, while making absolutely no efforts of escaping the clutches of the chair he was tied to. The answer to that question is best left to be provided by another fellow professional, XXV stated while referencing Dr. Gray. From one doctor to another, so to say, whom you will interact with shortly. He concluded his explanation. Let me guess. The wicked specialist had rediscovered impudence while manifesting it through his comments. If I don't comply, then you turn me in to the authorities, correct? Strauss inquired with a tunic of presumption sheathing his words. Tex XV took the time to gaze over at XTIIV before redirecting his vision back towards the doctor. Not quite, Dr. Strauss. Anders took a slight reprieve. Should you choose to not comply, my brother will kill you. Anders finished with grand sternness present. After hearing the Artiphenoid's unanticipated response, Strauss glanced over at Exthianth, who in turn produced a response to the doctor's optical inquiry. "That's a true story, mein Frere." Exekind roasted the doctor once again, utilizing the flame that is National Socialism. "And Auschwitz will seem like a summer camp compared to what I am going to do to you." The White Devil had finished the sentiment with grin of great satisfaction. The vexatious surgeon required a moment to himself before finally responding, as full comprehension of the situation had not quite yet entered his system. However, that was hardly required, as Kaiser found himself occupying a position of rather limited options. Fine. Another respite the doctor did require. "Now, if you two, fine gentlemen, would not mind, I would rather not spend the remainder of the night tied to this fucking chair." Jonathan Kaiser Strauss showed his teeth yet again. This was the conclusive notion, as the exchange between the three was no longer. With an agreement now in place, the trio had exited the premises of the house and proceeded to make their way to the mansion, where Grey had been patiently waiting for the arrival of his future unwitting partner. While inside the car, conquering the road, XXV had unveiled certain pieces of information to Strauss. In an effort to satiate the hunger of intrigue that had been dominating him ever since the trio had experienced their initial, proper introductions. The doctor, while most certainly unresolved, had placed his trust in these mysterious men, having very little choice in the matter, truth be told. Once the trio had arrived at the glorious estate, Exthianth had parted ways with XXV and Strauss, while Anders himself led the surgeon to the garage where Dr. Grey was located at. However, shortly after showing the new hire the way, Anders had left the aforementioned locale altogether. Dr. Strauss was left lonesome inside this feebly lit structure, not quite knowing what to expect. But little time had elapsed, and Grey himself made his classy entrance. "Welcome to the family, Dr. Strauss."